Hello, everyone. I'm Keystone, your host for HeroesX Office Hours. This is V12 of HeroesX, and today we're going to discuss a few of your other questions from the discussion board. And before I forget, I should mention that I'm here as always with Greg and Sarah and Aylin. But three of you, I know that you've prepared a few outtakes, as it were.
Yeah. So what we're noticing in the forums is that our participants are taking the opportunity to read very carefully some of the other focus passages and think very carefully about some of the issues. And so although we have an idealized schedule, we are also aware that people like to be able to take things at their own pace so that they can fully appreciate the rich content. And so there have been a number of questions and comments that have come up that we'd like to discuss with you and each other. So maybe Ellen, if you want to start.
Yes, indeed. So someone was asking about Jason and the earlier generation heroes. And was there any difference between the epic hero cult and the earlier generation hero cult?
Well, since Keith is my editor in this wonderful series called Classical Inquiries, where I try to contribute something every week, and I've been doing it for many years now.
2015, I think it was.
Was it? Oh, my goodness. It's getting to be then our 5th anniversary in February.
That's right.
My goodness. And one of the things that I've been working on is precisely that question, the earlier generation of heroes. If I may borrow from popular culture, it's as if the Iliad and the Odyssey were all about Star Trek, the next generation. But what about the previous generation, the quote unquote original Star Trek? And for something like 16 essays, I think I have already, plus there were 2 or 3 or 4 that preceded, that led up to the 16 essays. So that adds up to a lot of weeks. I've been working on Heracles, who is arguably the most prestigious of all heroes of that previous generation. And just to give an idea, I won't go on forever about this, about the importance of Heracles. I kind of don't like to say Hercules. I prefer Heracles or Heracles. He was participating in a Trojan War that preceded the Trojan War that is narrated in the Iliad and that is memorialized in the Odyssey. And there are references to this Trojan War one, or maybe it's better to say previous Trojan War, even in the Iliad. So the participant who's interested about that earlier generation, I would strongly suggest that just for the fun of it, for him or her to look at the essays that I've done on Heracles, where I go very deeply into how that kind of hero represents an earlier model of what a hero would be. So that's one answer. That's the answer that I would give as a student of comparative mythology. And I treat mythology as a system, and I treat myths historically, not in terms of saying that what myths tell us are what reality is to us. No, I treat myths historically by saying to myself, the people who actually lived by these myths are people that we have to understand, and we have to understand historically. So it's as if I'm being historical about the thought processes, not about what the thought processes tell me. It's a big difference, but it can still be scientific. It can still be rigorous. But I'm saying, okay, here's Greg doing comparative mythology approaches to heroes. But then what about archaeologists? I think of a researcher called Martin P. Nilsson, Nilsson, who did a very important book many decades ago on the Mycenaean origin of Greek myths. And by Mycenaean, let's say shorthand, the second millennium BCE, as opposed to the later first millennium BCE. And this person, when he wrote this book, was thinking purely in terms of archaeology. And the wonder of it is Linear B, which is the script that was used to record an early phase of the Greek language, had not yet even been deciphered. And yet this person, Nilsson, had already figured out that, for example, there was a Heracles myth in the second millennium before our era. That's pretty exciting. So here's another scientific approach with which I don't agree in some respects, where it turns out, yes, there was an earlier generation of heroes. Then one last thing, while I'm on the subject of archaeology, there's Nilsson, who concentrates on everything that archaeologists had found by his time in the area that we know as Greece. But then how about somebody like Anthony Snodgrass, who then is interested in, well, what were heroes like in the earlier centuries of the first millennium before our era? And it turns out that those heroes were also in many ways different from the heroes that we learn about by reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. So there are many, many layers, but I don't like to use the word layer because that suggests that you can't go from one layer to the other easily. What if there's an impenetrable layer? How about many different phases in the prehistory of the ancient Greek hero? And remember how we've been saying to each other, and now I do a third kind of scientific approach, how anthropologists say that most people in the world, most societies, have some kind of system for worshiping their ancestors. I don't care what we call it, ancestor worship or whatever. And if you like, a very holistic way of looking at heroes from the anthropological point of view, now this is the third kind of analysis, is to say that heroes are stylized ancestors. After all, in most societies, people can't really understand previous generations beyond their grandparents, or at best great-grandparents, and then after that it's all a big blur. There are systematic ways that societies in the world have figured out how to prefigure earlier ancestors who can't be traced back to reality as we know it, but who are a reality in the thinking process of traditional societies. Wow, I took too much time with that, but it shows what a good question it is. And I'm so glad we're going deep into some of the big questions that have been haunting us ever since the first hour.
So Greg, can I just pick up on something there? You mentioned how Heracles, part of his myth is taking part in an earlier, as it were, Trojan War. So we might compare him in some ways to the heroes of the Iliad. But then also, what about Jason? Would he have perhaps more in common with the Odyssey because he has a voyage, or does he sort of fit in a slightly different way?
I'm so glad you mentioned Jason, who is, may I put it this way, a proto-Argonaut. And Argonaut, ooh, that sounds mystifying because we really haven't talked about the good ship Argo very much. In fact, our group hasn't talked about it at all with our participants, but it turns out that Argo, this ship, that sailed off to the Far East to recover the Golden Fleece, that is a myth that is so old that it's not even really talked about in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Okay, in the Odyssey, a little bit. There's a wonderful expression in the Odyssey, Argo pasi melusa, which means Argo, the ship, which is on the minds of everybody. Well, is it really on the minds of everybody anymore? Maybe not. But Jason and the Argonauts and the ship Argo, Argonaut just means sailors who sail on the ship Argo. That is a myth that is so old that we just don't want to think about it as Homeric at all. What word are we going to use? Here's one. How about Orphic? Tracing back this tradition to a culture hero who's not Homer, but who is Orpheus. Oh, here's another hero we haven't really talked about. But it just shows once we start examining this kind of problem, we see other characters who are definitely, if I can go back to my rather silly popular culture analogy, the characters in Star Trek as opposed to Star Trek The Next Generation or the generation after that, which is what our group of participants have really been exposed to. One more thing about Jason. I love to say this to people I meet, even if I meet them for the first time. I'll say, hey, you have a beautiful heroic name. Did you know that Jason means the healer? And they'll say, no, does it really? People think that it's a name from the Bible. A lot of people do. Well, it's a Greek name, and it's a Greek name that's founded on practices of hero cult, or if you like, also ancestor worship. And here's the way it works. When you worship a hero, an ideal way to do it, and we can reconstruct it maybe best from reading the libation bearers of Aeschylus. Okay, that's 458 BCE, but it's still a very precious source of lore for us about how libation works. So let me just get to it. You pour blood, let's say, into the ground. Inside the ground, inside Mother Earth, is the corpse of a hero. The libation, the liquid that you pour into the earth that seeps down, will then make contact with the corpse. The corpse will ingest the blood and will have a temporary phase of consciousness. And in that phase of consciousness, the hero will tell things that you ask this hero, whether it's a male or female hero. And usually sacrifices are gender specific. So a woman would be pouring libations conceivably to a female hero, but sometimes it's not gender specific. In any case, when the contact is made, when that mental contact is made, and the hero then answers questions you ask, what's the first kind of question you're likely to ask as a worshiper of heroes? It's about your health. Am I going to be okay? I have horrible pain, or I am wasting away, or all the other things that humanity is plagued with. And then the answer will come in the form of something that heals you, even if not physically, at least mentally. And you know what the ancient Greek word for this answer is? It's diagnosis, diagnosis. And the earliest attestation of that word has to do with the function of the cult hero as a healer in hero cult. And here's the best part. Iason, if you look at the etymology of Jason, Iason means he who is willing to heal. It's not that he, in this case, it's masculine, that he's the healer. No, it's that he's willing to heal if you ask the question right, if your prayer is answered, and then if you get a good diagnosis, then Jason is the healer. So what I'm saying is that if you scratch the surface of Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, on their quest to find the golden fleece and bring it back home, well, a more basic function of Jason is the healer. How does that strike you? And so you see how these questions, these deep questions that our participants are grappling with, are really seeking answers that go to the core of not only what a hero is, but what in most societies is the goal in trying to make contact with your beloved dead, preferably your ancestors, because you're connected to your ancestors. So,
Yeah.
when it comes to the Argo that's mentioned in the Odyssey, okay, it's just once, Argo, pasi melusa, which is on the minds of everybody, is also relevant. Let me try to wind this up. And by way of the etymology of Argo, which means return to light and life. That's what that root means. So the ship is the vehicle for a return to light and life. And if you start comparing the Greek language with cousin languages like Sanskrit, especially older phases of the Sanskrit language, which is commonly known as Vedic, you'll see the mental ship, and how the mental ship that you launch with your sacrificial mind can go out and get things and then bring it back to you, and then you're whole again. You're integrated. That's a very short version of what you can accomplish by comparing Greek and Indic traditions, and you can keep comparing. May I joke till the cows come home? I mean, the cattle of the sun come home.
As long as nobody eats them.
Right. There's another question, and it's a popular question. In the absence of Odysseus, why didn't his father step up and became the king?
Because he was busy running the orchard, and the orchard is more important than the kingdom. And that's why, to get the kingdom back, the final act is to connecting the dots with every plant in the orchard. If you look at traditions of kingship, by comparing Greek traditions with, for example, Indic traditions, which I just mentioned, the ideal king is the ideal gardener. And you can't let the garden run down. Palaces may have crises, but orchards must stay forever. Of course, in a circular way, you recycle every spring, the orchard comes back to life. And when I say orchard, may I substitute vineyard, or may I substitute a wheat field, any kind of space that is understood as having some kind of direct contact with the cosmos. I hope that answer wasn't facile, but I'm just saying that the politics of the Odyssey are superseded by the cosmic imperatives of the Odyssey.
Well, that you were mentioning that connection with the vegetation and the hero that we see in the Philostratus, for example, where the vine dresser sees the hero appearing within that sort of context again. There's discussion a little bit about how some of these writers like Philostratus and Pausanias, describing a lot of cult hero evidence, provide a lot of evidence, but they were considerably later, sort of in the early Christian era. And to what extent may there be an influence from that belief system compared to what had
Yes.
been current in ancient Greek song culture, how much cross-cult fertilization, as it were, if I can use that expression.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to me, the wonder is, and could I go back again to the kind of experiences that anthropologists teach us? It turns out that when a system is robust, it doesn't talk about itself very much because it's robust. I like the fact that, no, I don't like the fact that something like the festival of Our Lady of Athens, Athena, the so-called Pan-Athenaea, is not all that much referred to in the 5th and 4th centuries, where we really want to know more about what it was like. Because everybody knew what it was like. Plato knew exactly what it was like. So we don't get to hear about it very much. And there's so many things like that in societies that anthropologists study, that if the system is really firing on all cylinders, it's not going to be, may I use the fancy word, self-referential. When a system starts getting vulnerable, and my goodness, by the time of the 3rd century of our era, the early 3rd century, okay, but it's already 3rd century, which is the era of Philostratus, who apparently was a priest and he knew a lot of things. But my goodness, the system was really getting very weak and very fragile. And it's almost like that wonderful poem by Sully Prudhomme about the broken vase, une vase brisée, that when you just touch the broken vase, it can just shatter. So even the slightest, shall we say, additional stimulus may just make it keel over, or in this case, disintegrate. That's the way I look at the system, so to speak, of hero cult in the days of Philostratus. It's very fragile. And what happens to a system when it is threatened with destruction? It refers to itself. It's self-referential more and more. Look at me, look at me, look at me, because maybe this is the last time you see me. And so that's what I think I see. Yeah.
And you've drawn some parallels with evidence also from the Odyssey, where it's not spelled out,
Yes.
but there are so many similarities. So there was another question about actually the appearance of gods, that in the epic, they usually appear in some sort of disguise, and what's going on there. And then I was also thinking about how, as we start to read the tragedies, sometimes we have the gods appearing on stage. And is that partly because of the medium, or what's going on there? Why don't the gods appear in their own form?
Yes. Well, I think that too has to do with all sorts of crises that are buffeting systems of how you relate to powers that are superhuman, and I think the more diverse a society gets, again, the harder it is for contact to happen between us humans and these superhuman personalities that populate our cosmos, and the cosmos itself becomes less and less clear. So gods have to make that extra effort. Is, look, you can really relate to me. I can make an epiphany to you, and then we react. Oh, my sweet Lord! It gets almost sentimental. It's like being reunited with a lover that you have been alienated from. And there are beautiful statements about this, especially in the 2nd century of our era. And I'm thinking of this thinker called Dio, who talks about how we humans, we just have this yearning for gods. And at night we wake up from a nightmare and we reach upward for the gods that are there, who would be comforting us like a loving parent. Say, what's wrong? Did you have a nightmare? So it's it's a delicate thing. It's a delicate thing, and the fact that we have these wonderful narratives of divinities making epiphanies and trying to be as real to us as they possibly can, not scaring us. Well, sometimes they do, but it all depends, right? But the contact has to be more and more and more immediate, and that's why in the book about heroes, I do have a quotation from Dio, which I think answers so beautifully what I cannot answer in an articulate way. Here's a person in the 2nd century of our era who tells you about how difficult it is to relate to some sky beings who are up there somehow, and how even things like a statue of Zeus at Olympia then brings him to us. And there it's done in terms of a pseudo interview where Phidias, the sculptor, is saying, well, the reason I made this sculpture of Zeus and the reason it's become a wonder of the world is because this way people can relate to him. Just as we can relate to Zeus better, whether we're scared or whatever we feel, when Zeus nods his head and there's this beautiful hair cascading from his head, and that, according to Phidias, is what inspired him to make the statue of Zeus that people can relate to. So it's all a matter of, could I say it this way? It sounds new age, relating.
Well, I know our meeting is running out of time, so we'll have to come back next time for some more of these questions. Thanks for bringing them to us. And thanks, Greg.
Well, thank you, wonderful colleagues, and thank you, participants out there, for digging so deep, because it's worth doing. We need to dig deep and think very hard.
All right. See you next time.